Hello everyone, I'm Nayaswami Asha, and we are continuing our study of the essence of the Bhagavad Gita explained by Paramhansa Yogananda as remembered by his disciple Swami Kriyananda. There's a lot of nuances in the titles here, that the teachings that of the Bhagavad Gita are directly from Yogananda. The articulation of them has been by his disciple, and now here I am in the way of this wonderful chain of the passing on of spiritual idealism. I learned from Swamiji what Master taught him, and now I'm trying to share with you the way in which these teachings apply to our lives at this time, in whatever way I can. We are now up to the second chapter, stanza number 46 of the Gita. Prior to this time, up until chapter 2, stanza 40, Swamiji was just commenting in a general way, summarizing all of the stanzas, and now, from now to the end of the book, we're going stanza by stanza. So number 246. To the knower of Brahman, the Supreme Spirit, the Vedas are of no more use than a well when the land all around is in flood. Now, of course, there's many ways to interpret this. And Swamiji begins with a story of St. Francis giving away his only copy of the Bible, and then feeling that somehow he had acted wrongly in relationship to God and His holy word. But Christ reassured him by saying that my word lives in your heart, and you have no need any more of the printed copy. And that is the most obvious and common explanation of this verse, and it's a valid one. But Swamiji also uses, as he himself puts it, since the Vedas have been mentioned, I'm going to use this as an opportunity, he said, to talk a little bit about some of the things that Master said about the Vedas, and I'm going to spend a few minutes now also talking about that. There's several aspects to this. As you all know, I'm an American raised in America, and so my experience of these spiritual teachings did not come from childhood and did not come from growing up in a Hindu culture. I encountered these teachings when I was 18 years old, first through the writings of Vivekananda, the life of Sri Ramakrishna, and then when I was 22, when I met Swami Kriyananda and really felt that I'd found my final resting place in the path of self-realization as Yogananda taught it. But all of it was brand new to me. So the benefit of this, I think, is one of the reasons why Yogananda started his work in America. In many ways, America, he sometimes said, and Swamiji reiterated, was really the only country in the world where this could have be started. Excuse me, that was what Swami Kriyananda said. I don't know if Master ever said that himself. But there was a clean slate, in a certain sense, so that Master could bring a very, very ancient teaching, but he could bring a new expression of it, and that new expression wouldn't be burdened by the resistance of old understandings. This is always the dilemma that a self-realized master faces, which is the teachings that all self-realized masters bring are all exactly the same. They come from the same state of realization. But once a master incarnates, he is bound by the culture and the civilization and the times in which he has incarnated. And he is also bound by the karma of the disciples that he has come to help. When I say bound, I don't mean bound in his own consciousness, but what he can offer has to be from the infinite possibilities, literally. He has to pull down those threads that are appropriate to move that society, that civilization, and those disciples forward in their next steps in a very practical way. Even the highest principles that are just abstractions, my understanding of them has often been formed, almost always been formed, either by some very practical, accessible example that Swamiji has given us, or by the example of his own life. I watched Swamiji for 4 decades work with so many different people, work spiritually with so many different people from so many different contexts, and always he could look at an individual and he could tell what their own next step forward would be. He never gave people the same answer twice, and he never gave two people the same answer. He gave everyone something that was vibrationally exact for where their next movement of expanded energy could come from. In, I believe, this book here, Swami Kriyananda also mentioned that he never saw Master respond the same way twice, because every situation is unique, because every soul is unique. And this accounts for the differences in the apparent differences in the teachings of masters that their disciples often take and make a huge inappropriate competition or contradiction out of, saying that my master said this and this one said that and this one is right and that one is wrong. And as the great disciples all say, if everyone truly understood their masters, there'd be no disagreement at all. It's just different needs at different times for different people. So what Master brought, and he was asked, is your teaching a new religion? He said, no, but it's a new expression. That even though ancient in its roots and ancient in its orthodoxy, it's orthodox to the essence. It's not orthodox to all of the ways of worship, as Swami called them, as opposed to the ways of awakening that get laid over a master's revelation. The master has a true revelation, and then generations of disciples, in an attempt to understand that, communicate it, often control it and define it, they just gradually bring it down. There's no other way to describe it. There's a marvelous book called I Was a Monk by John Tetmer, is his name. And to summarize a very interesting story, to make it very brief, he was a man who was drawn to be a Catholic priest from his early teens. He entered the seminary, he became a priest, he was very talented and very intelligent, and ended up being a highly educated Catholic theologian, and he worked in the Vatican, and he loved his life. He was a very happy monk, and he just loved everything about his life and threw himself into it completely. And as a result, after about 25 years of his priestly vocation, he was just exhausted, and he was sent off to take a sabbatical in Switzerland, where he could just rest. For the first time in his life, because he'd grown up on a farm in the Midwest of the United States and had worked from dawn till dark, first as the child of farmers and then later as a priest, and he'd never sat still with nothing to do ever in his life. And now for days at a time, by doctor's orders, he had to sit on the porch, the balcony of his hotel, and just look out over this beautiful Swiss countryside. And in that new context, just contemplating the beauty of God, he had a deep mystical experience, much deeper, he said, than he'd ever had in the prayers, in the church, doing anything. And what he had was he had a direct revelation about the nature of Jesus, the nature of Christ's revelation. He shared in some part in the revelations of Christ, the true revelations. And you realize that all of Catholic theology was wrong, that it was an imposition on something, and it really did not reflect the truth. And he felt obligated, out of spiritual integrity, to resign. So he left being a priest and a monk, and it broke his heart, because he loved his life, but integrity demanded it. He could no longer teach that which wasn't true. Now, for this reason, often, spiritual seekers, as we go along, one may be steeped in a tradition, and as it happened in my case, I wasn't steeped in the tradition that I later embraced for my life. But many of the people who have come to Paramhansa Yogananda's teaching of self-realization have come, for example, from a deep relationship to Jesus and the teachings of Christianity. And here Yogananda is expressing the fact that what he's teaching, he called it the second coming of Christ. And he came to teach the original teachings of Christianity. So many Westerners or non-Westerners who have been devoted to the teachings of Christ and yet find themselves drawn to Yogananda often have to go through this confusing reconciliation between what they have always understood to be the teachings of Jesus and then what the one they've now accepted as their guru, which is Yogananda, and what he says about the teachings of Jesus. I was raised Jewish, and I was not raised with any prejudice against Jesus, but it was essentially a blank slate, except what you pick up through osmosis growing up in at that time, primarily Christian country, which America was in my childhood. It's become more of a multicultural world now, but it wasn't when I was a child. When I finally read Master's interpretations of the gospel and his definition of Jesus and as an avatar, comparing it to the Bhagavad Gita and Krishna's statement, whenever virtue declines and vice predominates, I, the infinite spirit, incarnate in human form, and defining Jesus in terms of the Bhagavad Gita, well, I had no resistance to it. I had no alternative teaching to that. I was able just to open my eyes wide and my mind and heart completely and come up with the marvelously inadequate statement, wow, which is, I remember specifically holding the book in my hand, which at that time was just Xerox sheets of old articles. I remember closing the book. I was sitting outside and looking up at the trees and saying, wow, like that. And even at the time, being mildly amused. One avatar is talking about the teachings of another, and that's the best I can come up with. But in the moment, it was fully expressive. I also had this really deep understanding at that moment that nobody had ever told me the truth, that people had given me their sincere opinions, and they'd given me their traditions. But now I was really in contact with truth of an eternal nature, the eternal truth, Sanatana Dharma, in fact. And of course, I was thrilled, just thrilled to my core. Now, what this is all about, and where I'm going with all of this, for this particular verse, is one of the teachings that Paramhansa Yogananda brought, actually. It was brought first by his guru, Sri Yukteswar, has to do with the cycle of the yugas, and as to what yuga the world is really in at this time, and where we are in either the devolution or the evolution of the overall consciousness of planet Earth at this time. Now, in my background, I'd never heard of the idea of yugas at all. I'd never thought about it. Yes, it actually is, to be fair. It is in Western civilization, in Western teaching, in Greek philosophy, the golden, the golden, the bronze, the gold and the silver, the bronze and the copper age, or the iron age, as it's called. And there are many traditions in the ancient philosophy of Western civilization that talks about these four ages, because in higher ages, it's a world culture. That's one of the characteristics of higher ages, as distinct from, Dwapara and ascending after that, as distinct from Kali. In Kali Yuga, all forms are rigid, because Kali Yuga is a materialistic age, and when you're dealing with material things, everything is separate. The book, the cup, everything is separate. But one of the signs that our age is ascending, which is what I'm going to talk about in a moment, is that this fixed sense of matter is being shattered, both by experience, invention, and scientific theory. The idea that a cup and a book are inherently separate and never the two shall merge is scientific folly at this point. Everyone knows, at least in theory, that it's all just vibrating atoms, and that, in fact, they're exactly the same substance. They just appear to be different. Yes, they still appear to be different, but we now know that they aren't. We haven't really integrated that into our thinking, but we're working on it. And the very fact that I'm sitting here talking to all of you from my home in California to, I don't know exactly where all of you are situated, but none of you are in my living room. So to a small or large extent, we've simply dissolved the concept of physical separation. And in real time, if you're watching this in real time, we're sitting here together. And furthermore, if you're watching this later, after I've actually recorded it, then once again, time is being dissolved. Time and space is being dissolved. And we're sitting there, we'll be sitting there together without any physical proximity, but a meeting of the mind and spirit that is completely outside of time. So the whole idea of yugas, these great ages on the planet, when I first learned about it, which Yogananda talks about it in Autobiography of a Yogi, and Sri Yukteswar, his guru, talks about it in The Holy Science. Sri Yukteswar introduces it very systematically in the introduction to The Holy Science, explaining what the yugas are, that there's 4 ages, and that it's a 25,000-year cycle, and it's 12,000 years, 12,500 ascending, 12,500 descending. I have no capacity to verify these facts through my own direct revelation, but I can see the historical evidence of them. There is a superb book published by Ananda Crystal Clarity Publications from America. At the present time, it's not being published in India, although I devoutly hope that before too long it will be. It's simply called The Yugas, and it's written by 2 Ananda devotees, Joseph Selby and David Steinmetz, and it is possible to order it from America, and even though it's not an inexpensive book, I urge you to do so, or to contact one of the Ananda centers and see if someone could import it for you from America, because it's an original work using recognized, undisputed historical facts to verify Sri Yukteswar's statement of these 4 descending and 4 ascending ages, and also to verify where we are in that cycle. And that's what I'm bringing up here, because it wasn't until I traveled in India and talked to even our committed devotees, our meaning those who have embraced Yogananda's path and are in the process of absorbing those teachings into their lives, that I realized how deeply ingrained in the Indian culture is the error that Sri Yukteswar refers to and that Yogananda refers to in his books, that I, as a Westerner, just passed over as insignificant. The belief that the world is still in Kali Yuga and will be in Kali Yuga for something like another 400,000 years, some fairly grim prospect. Not that it matters, really, because we have a generational span. One has a certain span of life, and once you're off the planet, it doesn't matter what's going on. Because the yugas, it's very important to understand, the yugas are a physical phenomenon related to a physical planet. They are a material world condition. They are a space and time condition. They're not an astral condition. They're not a soul condition. It's a physical planet, has a physical relationship in space to the grand central point of the galaxy in which the planet exists, and it orbits in relationship to that center, and that center emanates power, and the closer the planet is to that power, the more enlightened the whole planet is. The farther away it is from that central emanating source of power, the less enlightened the planet is. That's why it has a 25,000-year cycle, because it takes 12,500 years to do half of this elliptical orbit moving toward the center, and then the other half moving away. So Sri Yukteswar asserted that the nadir of that cycle, which would be the least enlightened point of this planet, was 500 AD. And if you look at the history, the ancient history of the planet, and going farther back than that, which is what Joseph Selby and David Steinmetz do in that fabulous book, The Yugas, as I repeat, from known, undisputed historical facts or artifacts or whatever it might be, it shows just what a barbarian period that was. Everywhere in the world, especially in the West perhaps, but everywhere in the world. I don't have all the facts at my fingertips, but the book itself is very convincing. But I wouldn't have needed the book. The book simply supports what Sri Yukteswar declared and what Master verified, which was these are the facts, and that since 500 AD we've been on an ascending cycle. And in fact, and Sri Yukteswar says that the reason that that fact is not known and that the tradition in India is confused is because, and it's hard for me to think in these terms because I'm not as much a part of the culture as some of you are, the Indian culture, that at the time when Yudhishthira and Arjuna and the Pandava brothers left their kingdom at the end of their reign and went off to give up their bodies, essentially, they left the kingdom in charge of their grandson, and everyone who was associated with them went with them, and as a result, ignorance. There was a radical decline of wisdom in that kingdom, and from that point, Sri Yukteswar explains, the misunderstanding set in, because by definition, at the lowest ebb of Kali Yuga, enlightenment and cosmic understanding is also at its lowest ebb. And something like the subtleties to understand the yugas, to be able to calculate them astronomically, it's not astrological, it's astronomical, all that knowledge is the very knowledge that's being lost. So it's only natural that coming out of Kali Yuga, we're going to be moving into a more enlightened age in which fixed realities of the Kali that came in, that were imposed upon the revelations of the masters during that Kali Yuga time, will now be unraveled. And if you were thinking about the descending yugas and the ascending yugas as two halves of an elliptical circumference, you would realize that when you're descending on this side and ascending on this side, you'll be at a parallel latitude, you might say, a parallel level of understanding. So at the same time that knowledge is lost, descending, knowledge is gained, ascending. So at the very point when a true understanding of the yugas was lost, as we ascend, a true understanding of the yugas is regained. And this is also why the avatars keep reincarnating, because either descending or ascending, truth has to be adjusted. It has to be offered again in a way that will be acceptable and understood. The very writing of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana was done, as the sage who wrote it explained, because the age was descending, and it wasn't going to be possible for the inhabitants of this planet as a whole to hold in their consciousness these deep truths. So they needed to be presented in ways that even the Kali Yuga mind could grasp. Now, just to make this clear, a corollary of this is that Master said, when he was asked, specifically by Swami Kriyananda, do we always keep reincarnating on the same planet? And Master just laughed and said, oh no, there are a multitude of planets that we can incarnate on. I mean, planet Earth is part of this huge galaxy, and it's at the edge of the galaxy, and we have no idea how many planets are here. The idea that we are the only inhabitable or intelligent life on the planet, as Master said, creation teems with consciousness. Creation is living consciousness. And it's just a fact. There are many inhabitable planets. And the concept of the yugas is not the drama of the jiva, it's not the drama of the individual soul. The soul moves in and out of the material world as it works out its various levels of karma, its material karma. When the physical body dies, it goes to the astral world, and when it's time to reincarnate, it chooses a time, place, culture, atmosphere, yuga, that is suitable for whatever lessons that soul needs to learn. And so if planet Earth is too advanced or too gross to benefit that jiva, then the jiva will just go somewhere else. Master added something not cheering for that too. He said, if you kept coming back only to the same planet, you would find out too fast, which is sort of, you would think God would want you to find out too fast. But what Master was really saying is that every victory over delusion has to be a genuine inner victory, and not just having hung around long enough to recognize the pattern. You have to really, it has to be an expansion of realization and a repudiation of delusion, not merely a lucky guess. And that's what he was saying in his rather jocular way at that moment. So each time there's a shift, or in preparation for such a shift, there's a new revelation, because the revelation has to be adjusted. I've commented several times, those of us who are more familiar with the New Testament, Jesus uses many examples that are not so easy for us, especially in the modern world, to understand. He talks about herding animals, taking care of sheep, harvesting wheat, using a scythe in a field, the growing of crops, the process of the harvest, all these sorts of things. And when the Christian Bible is being studied in an industrialized country like America, people have to spend a long time trying to understand those examples. And they don't have the immediate impact on the reader or the listener that they did when Jesus spoke to them. When he was challenged for healing someone on the Sabbath, because the Sabbath was supposed to be a day of rest, this was really his persecutors just trying to catch him up in some technicality, and Jesus wasn't going to be fooled by that. But his answer was, if one of your sheep fell into the ditch on the Sabbath, would you just leave the sheep there to suffer and perhaps die? No, of course you would lift him out of the ditch. And Jesus was saying, well, these suffering humans are my sheep, and if I see them suffering, even if it's the Sabbath, I'll lift them out of the ditch. I won't just leave them there to suffer. That's not what God intended with his rules for the Sabbath. And every person who was listening to him, who had a flock of sheep and either depended on it for their livelihood, or had progressed to the point of genuine affection for the animals who relied upon them, knew exactly what Jesus meant. No, of course they wouldn't leave their sheep in the ditch. But of course a modern reader who's never been within 500 yards of a living sheep has no response to that at all. And so Master has to come, a new revelation has to come and talk in terms of what we know about. And so in America especially, Master talked about business and success and science and radio and television and movies. And everybody said, yes, yes, I understand that, in exactly the way that Jesus understood sheep. Now that, by comparison, is a somewhat superficial shift related to the yugas. There was one more thought here. One interesting feature about the coming of Jesus, because if the nadir of Kali Yuga, as Sri Yukteswar and Master assert, was 500 AD before we started up the other side, and that was a time when barbarians swept across the world and destroyed much of the evidence of advanced civilization, burned libraries, and many really, from the point of view of dignity, nobility, and refinement, much was simply destroyed. But Jesus had established his teachings just a few centuries before, and many of those who followed him, because the age was so low and getting worse, the sincere and deep followers of the revelation of that Master took those teachings and they hid it. They hid it in monasteries. They didn't live among people. The tradition of the Desert Fathers, they went way off into secluded places, and they took with them their teachings and their manuscripts, and other important books of the time, and they hid them and held them, so that even when the barbarians were destroying so much of it, they literally kept the light of civilization alive. And during that same period in India, the teachings of India were held in the caves of the Himalayas and in the snows of Tibet. That's where it was. It wasn't in the marketplace. It was held away because the yuga everywhere was simply too gross. It couldn't be disseminated among the mass of people. So it was held back in that way. And in the teachings, the path of self-realization, the path of Yogananda as we're following it now, as I'm sharing it with you, when Lahiri Mahashaya in the middle of the 1800s was drawn to the Himalayas by his guru Babaji. This story is told in Autobiography of a Yogi, and re-met his guru in this incarnation, and remembered then his memory of his discipleship was reawakened. At least that's how the story is told. And he was initiated by Babaji into the art of Kriya Yoga and told to initiate those who were willing to renounce everything in order to follow the spiritual path. Well, that was an articulation of the tradition up to that point, which was that the teachings were hidden away in the Himalayas, and no person living an ordinary life was privy to what the masters in the Himalayas were protecting. I often think also that they were carefully hidden from the British. So the wealth of India that was obvious could be stolen by the British. The jewels and the gold and all of that, as the wealth of Britain rose and the poverty of India increased in a very suspicious relationship that makes cause and effect obvious. The real wealth of India, which has always been these extraordinary teachings and the power of its masters, was hidden away. And the British were collectively, were too materialistically oriented to know what they could have gotten. But when Lahiri Mahashaya received that guidance from Babaji, he protested. He said, but very few can renounce the world, and many could be helped by this teaching. So Babaji, as the story is told, took that as the divine will and gave Lahiri permission to give the Kriya to anyone who sincerely asked for it. So then this new expression came. You see, not a new religion, no departure from the actual tradition, but a new expression. And Lahiri came back and lived in Varanasi, where he had been living, continued to live his householder life, but also began to share Kriya with others like himself. And this was the beginning of the rising of this new reality, because the strict separation of the spiritual life and ordinary life is a factor of Kali Yuga. And in Dwapara Yuga, what happens is that spirit and ordinary life are completely integrated. Well, let me say, when Dwapara Yuga begins, that integration begins to happen. It's hardly so, because our modern world is still ruled by the Kauravas. It's just greed and money everywhere, and materialism. And even India is going through, as Swamiji described it, an important and necessary stage of regaining its material efficiency and material wealth. Swami put it I thought very accurately. He said, India is simply far too important to the destiny of this planet not to take her place among the leaders of this world, the nations that lead this world. And the impoverishment was imposed upon it falsely by the fact that it was under the control of another culture. And now that it has its own integrity back, now it has to catch up. And there's this temporary obscuration of the highest values that have always characterized India. but it's quite temporary. And it's very interesting, actually, just as an interesting fact, that the generational age, the chronological age of the devotees interested in this path of self-realization, and Ananda's expression of it in India is much lower than it is. Many more young people are drawn to this teaching in India than collectively they are in other countries at this point. And I think that's because this generation is deeply spiritual. It's a very East-West generation. And they're looking for a way to combine both cultures. And now all of this brings me now to this verse, but all of that background was necessary to describe this verse. Now what Swamiji describes, and this is again reiterated much more in the book called The Yugas, which you can order from, you have to order it from America, Crystal Clarity Publications, but it's definitely worth ordering. He talks about that the Vedas, and this is how Yogananda explained it, are unique among the world's scriptures because they were composed in a high age, when, as Master puts it, there was no division between the spiritual life and daily life as there is today. Then, in the sense that just even the fact, the essential fact of Sanatana Dharma was known by everyone, which is that all of creation is a manifestation of Satchidananda, and all that we do is meant to be an expression of God's presence within. Certainly this fact is more clearly known in the Indian culture, but nonetheless there's still a lot of confusion. And in the West, of course, it's completely forgotten. And now, the way Swamiji writes this, and I'll just read just to make it clear, people then had no need for separate places or times of worship. All life to them was, in a sense, worship, and every act an offering to God. And here's what Swami says: as people's understanding declined, as the age descended, and consciousness itself became less subtle, it became necessary to write down in words the truths people had been able to memorize effortlessly. At that time it became necessary to explain, for example, the gunas, or the duality inherent in all things, and how everything came into existence. Prior to that, it wasn't necessary to write it down, because people's consciousness as a civilization on the whole planet was sufficiently advanced that they were simply able to directly perceive this. I mean, we really have to turn our awareness around a little bit in order to genuinely understand this, because of course our experience is not that at this time, but we know it philosophically that these are the facts, but we're not able to see them, and we think it's about our individual state of realization, which of course it is, because the yugas are just the backdrop against which the drama of individual realization takes place. But it's also the collective state of the planet, that this planet is in a lower level, and so civilization as a whole reflects a lower level of consciousness. Material wealth, personal comfort, egoic satisfaction, sensual pleasure. These are all the values of this culture, this planet at this time in the evolution of the yugas. At the peak of Satya Yuga, all values are spiritual, because all life is spiritual, and you don't have to write down and explain what is just common knowledge. In the Yugas book, Joseph and David explain how that from our perspective, we think that the advent of written language was a sign of increasing evolution. The Western picture is that there was the cavemen were down here and we're here, and it's been a straight expanding evolutionary line like this. We don't, as a Western civilization, have a circular sense of civilization. And because in America especially, we have no history beyond a couple of hundred years, no artifacts, nothing, this system sort of works better here, like this. I mean, it's crazy to think of this as the peak of evolution. Well, in and of itself is terrifying and very discouraging. So as a result, anything in history has to be lower than what we have now and has to be on an ascending arc. So when the advent of written language came, the conventional Western historical perspective is that we had advanced to the point where we could write things down. Now, from the point of view of the yugas, we had descended to the point where it was now necessary to write down and explain what prior to that was simply intuitively understood by everyone. So the Vedas definitely represent, and this is what Swamiji says too, they are unique in the scriptures of the world because they originated from such a high age, and the principles that they describe are so extremely elevated, and everything about them is the most elevated remnant we have of those highest ages, because interestingly, you see, in the highest ages, there's no necessity to create material documents or expressions or even buildings, because everyone is so in tune with all of creation that you don't have to bring very much down to concrete expression. It can all be experienced as energy and consciousness. So that very high age was brought down to the level of the Vedas, which still represent the highest scriptural and spiritual expression really in common usage today. Conceivably hidden away somewhere, there's something even more elevated than that, but not likely, because more than that, as I was saying, doesn't require physical form. So it became necessary to write things down. And then, in the descending age, it was seen also to be necessary to offer people religious practices that would help them keep in touch with these highest principles, and also that would satisfy their increasingly worldly and ego-affirming needs. Now, we're talking on a very subtle level here, which is to say rituals that would enable them to gain what they now wanted in terms of power, mates, children, success. He doesn't mention physical health and removing obstacles, but all of a sudden now, because we have become slightly separated from the world around us, we are in this reaching for relationship. Instead of always moving in the sense of the perfect power and presence of the divine, and intuitively and naturally responding to those streams of higher consciousness, which is the picture that's given to us in the golden ages, the highest ages of Satya Yuga on this planet. Now all of a sudden there's this matter blinds us a little bit, and we live more in our bodies, and we are more identified with our egos as a civilization. So the Vedas begin to teach us how to sort of get back into that state of harmony that is our natural state. And so they articulate it. So although people's consciousness was diminishing in clarity, there was still a spiritual bias in everything they did. Rituals, therefore, were created that would enable human beings to work in cooperation with devas, angels, and higher forces. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with any of this, and it's all true teaching. And what happens, of course, is as the age descends, we use that which is appropriate for that age. But then what happens, and this is where I was saying before, then the yugas begin to ascend again, and there is a new revelation. And that new revelation is absolutely consistent with the old revelation, but it is now offered in the context of where the planet is at this time. And these avatars come for a world-changing purpose in order to help the planet as a whole understand where it's supposed to go and what it's supposed to be. And Master has done some very interesting writing about the progression of these avatars in the way they set the message for the age. And that's why when Master was asked if he brought a new religion, he said no, he brought a new expression. And that new expression, however, was, as he described it, the original teachings of Jesus and the original teachings of Krishna. And then he was also going to show how Christ and Krishna were speaking the same way. The title Krishna is considered to be the name of the avatar. Christ is considered to be the name of the avatar, but both are actually titles, and they're very close in sound, Christ and Krishna. When you say it like that, Master used to often write Krishna to try to get people to see how the words would go together. And they were both referring to a state of being anointed in divine consciousness. Now, if Master came, as he claimed, now let me stop for a moment. In the West, because that's the side that I was more familiar with until I traveled to India and became more familiar with that culture as well, your culture as well. It was very interesting to see how Yogananda took the teachings of the Bible and what the churches declared was the teachings of the Bible and showed, by pulling the Bhagavad Gita into it primarily, what Jesus truly intended. And I was describing earlier, I had no prejudices against that. Many of my friends who were deeply steeped and uplifted earlier in their lives by what Yogananda called churchianity, as distinct from Christianity, had to undo a lot of conditioning, a lot of prejudice, and had to develop inwardly a certain faith in their guru, that even though this contradicted centuries of tradition, that this was in fact the new expression of this ancient teaching. And so this is how Master, and this is why Swami took the time to insert this into this part of the Gita commentary, what Master came to do was also to do the same for the Indian culture, which is to respect the value of the ancient teaching as it has been passed down from a time no one can even chart now, which is the point at which Satya Yuga had descended, perhaps into Treta Yuga. I don't know exactly when the Vedas are said to have been done, but nonetheless consciousness had fallen to the point where it had to be articulated. And then that has carried us all the way through the darkest parts of Kali Yuga, all the way through Kali Yuga, ascending now to Dwapara, which Sri Yukteswar explained that the transition started in 1700, Dwapara proper started in 1900. And so now, according to his explanation, we are in Dwapara Yuga rising, and coming up on the other side, that which has been essential through all this time, we're in a new expression. Yogananda is here to tell us the original teachings of Christianity. Now, I've been in India enough to realize that this is not an easy transition. And I spent 4.5 months in India over the last 14 months, or when I returned from India in February or March of 2014. I had spent 4.5 months of the previous 14 in India, which was quite a lot of time, and very deeply immersed in trying to communicate to mostly Indian audiences the principles of the original teachings of Krishna, as I have come to understand them through Swami Kriyananda and Master, unencumbered by a classical Indian education, which is the good and the bad news. But therefore, I understand how deeply steeped we are in the Indian side in the power of the orthodoxy of the Vedas and so on, and the necessity to make everything conform to the power of those traditions. And I meditated very deeply on trying to think how and why exactly I, as a Westerner, am delivering this message. But from much that I've said, you can easily extrapolate why. And you can also see why Master came to America to do this. He needed to be outside. He needed to be completely outside of that context, so that he could create a genuinely new expression. And it is significant that Yogananda brought to America really almost nothing of the orthodoxy of that teaching. I mean, just very, very little ritual, an occasional mantra and a fire ceremony, but very little of the traditional chanting of the names of God, just very little of that. And he could have brought it all. He was completely versed in it. He had every possible access to it, but this is a new expression. And just as devotees of Jesus have had to break the deeply inculcated dogmas, understanding of what Jesus intended, so Master intends for those of India, the country that he reveres and speaks of with so much devotion. He died. His last words were a poem, which was a paean of praise to the culture of India and his own deep desire to be born again in that land, the homeland of his spirit. Nonetheless, this is a new expression. And integral to that new expression is an acceptance of Sri Yukteswar's declaration that the commonly accepted interpretation of the yugas is not true, that we're in Kali Yuga and will remain so for 400,000 years. You see, it all goes together, because if you accept Sri Yukteswar's explanation of the yugas, then that helps us understand when the Vedas were written, why they were written, and why our relationship to aspects of the Vedas, not of course the essential message of them, but the practices dictated by the Vedas, may no longer be the heart and soul of how we define our spirituality. You see how important it is? The most amazing aspect of the teachings of Master, the revelations of self-realization, is he brought them to America, and then as Swami Kriyananda very deeply absorbed them into himself and re-articulated in modern English, such as this book. The teachings in this book are Yogananda's understanding, direct revelation of Krishna's intention. And in the first classes of this book, I said that Yogananda himself said that he was Arjuna. So I think if anyone can say what Krishna intended, it would be Yogananda. I don't want to assert that too emphatically, because that's disempowering. It becomes a matter of belief. The truth, as Swami often said, should speak for itself. But nonetheless, all of these are interwoven, because I've had devotees in India, when I talked to them about the yugas, and they relaxed enough to be frank with me. Many of them, many very sincere followers of Yogananda's path, just disregarded that fact. because it was so contrary to the cultural understanding. I, of course, had no way of knowing that, and I was a little surprised to hear it sometimes. But you can't disregard any aspect of a guru's teaching, because it's all integral, because our relationship to the Vedas is partly based, largely based on this whole idea of the yugas and the necessity for rituals. I'm not suggesting that we throw them away. I don't think it's necessarily time to throw them away, but their relative importance on this path of self-realization, if we are going to follow Yogananda's teachings, have to be integrated into this whole study. Now, and this is what Swamiji says is also implied here. To the knower of Brahman, the Vedas are no more useful. Now, of course, as I said, this is almost always interpreted to mean to the man of realization. What need have you for ritual? Because the goal of those rituals has been attained. But there's another implication here that Krishna was putting forward, which is what this whole talk has been about, that Yogananda asserts, which is also to the man of self-realization in this time and this place, to the one who strives for self-realization. We also have to understand that we are dealing with a new expression. Now, I want to just put one more small point on this. This is not only a question of what our daily practices are, because the rituals in the Vedas are true. The powers described are true. It's not like it's untrue. It's not like those mantras and so on don't work. Of course they work. They came from a very high age, and they do. But just a moment, the thought is slipping away from me. Let me find it here. Yes. Very often in discussions with people, when I have been in discussions with people from India about Master's teachings, I see people themselves blocking even their capacity to think for themselves on the basis, but that's not what the Vedas say. A couple of weeks ago, I think in this class or perhaps in another one, I made reference to an unfortunate exchange that I had with a devotee in India who was disputing Swami Kriyananda's creation of the Nayaswami order, which is fully explained in a website called A New Renunciate Order for a New Age, or the Nayaswami order, where you can look up and read it. And he wrote an entire book explaining what he was doing and why he was doing it. And it's a very thoughtful discussion. By no means did Swami Kriyananda ever, or Master, just blatantly disregard millennia of revelation. It was always thoughtfully and carefully and consciously and intuitively done. And Swami Kriyananda never presents to us dogma just to take it or leave it. He always explains very carefully how he arrived at his conclusions so we can take those steps with him. So when this man protested the assertion that I could be a sannyasi and still be a married woman and dressed in blue and not orange, because that's not the way it's done. The Vedas, the tradition, Hinduism, that's not the way it's done. And I encouraged him to at least thoughtfully read this book and meditate on it before he just made that declaration. But you see, when the yugas change, everything changes. And when an avatar comes to restore the fundamental truth and to remove a great deal of the useful at the time but now no longer applicable traditions that have been laid on top of that, we also have to have the courage to follow their creative revelation, even if it challenges that which has become accepted. I wrote to my friend when I was describing this, every reformer is considered a heretic at first. And some are heretics, and time proves that their revelation was not an advancement. But many heretics of the past become the saints of the future when the collective consciousness grows to embrace it. And so in the meantime, we as individuals have to have the courage of our faith and the courage of our common sense and the courage of our intuition to listen carefully and reflect deeply and embrace a new expression when it's offered to us. God bless you.